The next step would be having these information that we have from the vision, hearing, and touch to what we call working memory. So that is the reason I'm talking about, okay, here we are just providing a cognitive framework, count the numbers of the areas that you have here. And here there are some subcortical areas. If you know the name, here is the putamen. These blue, greenish areas are the insular cortex. So this is what we call connectogram. And when we talk about connectogram, it's not only about brain areas or brain kind of functions. And based on the framework that we discussed before, as you can see here, when we talk about attention and voluntary attention, when we talk about voluntary cognitive processes, we are probably talking about something that is conscious. So being something that is voluntary is probably something that is related to the consciousness. And also when we talk about things that are declarative, things that we can talk about them, so things that are in the control of our language. These are basically people who are wakeful, so they are not asleep, but there is no content in their cognitive processes. Okay, so that is another kind of way of trying to kind of make different dimensions for consciousness. Thinking about the level of consciousness and content of consciousness. And to be honest, for us as a cognitive neuroscientist, probably the content is the most important part. And we really like to know how we can increase the awareness regarding the cognitive functions. So you can see these areas are labeled here, and so you can find these labeled here, and you can relate them to the anatomy of the brain. So this is how the anatomy of the brain and these areas are related, and then you need to know about these different areas. But now we need to go one step ahead. But interestingly, brain is not very much affected by these items in a way that brain would perceive most of things around us in a consistent way. Otherwise, the world around us was scary in the morning, because in the morning you could see things in a little bit different way every day, and that would make things really complex. Okay, hello everyone. I'm really happy that we are starting the first session of our cognitive neuroscience course. The course is named as Foundations of Brain Functions in a sort of pragmatic and clinical approach. So we will see what are the things that we are going to cover in 14 sessions. And I'm trying to divide each session to 4 or 5 different parts to make it easier for you to be able to follow. And today we are going to be mainly focused on 3 major topics. First of all, we are going to talk about some frameworks that could summarize what is happening in the cognition or different brain functions or different cognitive processes. Then we are going to talk about some other frameworks to have a better understanding about the structure of the brain and how the brain is working. And meanwhile, we are going to also talk about some neurocognitive frameworks. So that is the plan that we are going to follow for today. In the first part, we are going to kind of see how we can summarize what is happening inside the brain in the process of cognition. So what are the cognitive processing that are happening inside the brain? Just before starting to talk about different sorts of models to summarize what is happening in the brain during the process of cognition, let's think about a scenario. You are thinking about the situation that we are facing with this COVID-19 pandemic. Let's think about when you are facing with a challenge like kind of the uncertainty that we have with COVID-19 situation. So we really don't know what is going to happen in the future. So let's think that if you are thinking about this process for 10 minutes, what are the cognitive processes that are going to be involved? So if you are sitting in a place and you are thinking about what is happening, what is going to happen in the future regarding COVID-19, what are the cognitive functions that are going to be engaged in that process, and how your brain would start to process different scenarios for the future. So use the chat space and bring up the cognitive functions or brain functions that would be involved in the process of kind of thinking about the future and what is going to happen with COVID-19 situation. So we are going to think about the specific cognitive processes that are involved in thinking about what is going to happen in the future with this pandemic. So I'm seeing the chat space here. Okay, decision making, problem solving, memory, deduction, control, emotions. Good. Anxiety, learning, memory, planning, fear. Okay, good. Logic, emotions, attention. Okay, good. So you have few ideas at least about what are the cognitive processes that are going to be involved. During the entire course, I'm going to give you a more comprehensive view about different sorts of cognitive processings that are involved in human behavior, in how we think about different processes. And it's not just about thinking about what are the cognitive processes that are involved in human cognition, but also thinking about how we might be able to modify these brain processes. So that is going to be another important issue, because it's not just about learning what is happening inside the brain. It's also about, is there any chance that we can modulate these cognitive functions? So that is a major issue in terms of how we can pragmatically modify these cognitive processes in a way that would help us to have a better life. So that is another aspect of the cognitive neuroscience. So I think that cognitive neuroscience is not just about learning what is happening inside the brain. We also need to learn, okay, if we know what is happening inside the brain, the next step would be, okay, is there any chance that I can modify these cognitive processes with different sort of interventions? So that is going to be another important part of this course that we will discuss about in the next steps. Okay, just to give you an overview about different sort of cognitive functions that are involved in human cognition, let me just give you a really simple heuristic framework. Okay. So first of all, let's think about the inputs that we have inside the brain. So we have different sorts of inputs into the brain. So we can have, let's say, visual processing, we can have visual kind of hearing, we can have touch, can have different sorts of inputs into the brain, okay? And they would go into what we call a sensory buffer. And sensory buffer would be something temporary. So we will have the information here for something like few seconds. So we'll keep the information in the sensory buffer for just few seconds. And we might be able to have what we call attentional capture. And by attentional capture, I mean when you see a snake, that would engage your visual processing, and then you have what we call the bottom-up attentional processing. That would increase the amount of information that would go inside to your visual system. The next step would be having these information that we have from the vision, hearing, and touch to what we call working memory. So working memory is going to be an important part of what we are going to discuss in this course. How the information would go through this sensory buffer to what we call working memory. And then we will have what we call a top-down voluntary attention. And that is going to be another really important topic for discussion, what we call voluntary attention. And probably what we are talking about is about a conscious process. So it is what we call about a voluntary kind of attentional process. That is something in our consciousness. So we control information that is going to enter to the working memory, and we start to process that with what we call executive function. So that is what we call executive functions. Okay. And then we talk about working memory. Working memory is a small kind of space for storing information that are needed to be readily available for your cognitive processes. When we talk about working memory, we need to think about two major processes that are involved in working memory. One is a verbal process, and the other is a visual process. So we have space to be able to keep some words, some numbers in the working memory. We're just repeating them one after each other. So when we want to keep a phone number in our working memory for a while, we are just repeating those numbers in our working memory to be able to keep them in the working memory for a while. So that is the way that we keep information in the verbal memory, in the verbal working memory, what we call verbal rehearsal. Okay? Meanwhile, we have a visual working memory that we call a visual spatial sketchpad. So it's something like a sketchpad that you are keeping some visual information inside, and you use that information for some other kind of visual or mental imagery processes. So when we talk about working memory, we are talking about two divided systems. One is verbal, the other is visual. And these two systems are working together. And at the end of the day, when we use these processes together, we do action planning, what we call decision making, and then we will have kind of response. And that would be the end of the process. So that is a really simplified version of what is happening when we have information inside the brain, and then we will have output from the brain functions. But meanwhile, there are some really important functions that are involved in this process that we have not mentioned. So we have some processes that we call memory processes, or things that are stored in our brain from before, based on our previous experiences, based on our life experiences, based on what we have learned before. All those informations are recorded in what we call memory, knowledge, and skills. Okay? And when we talk about these functions, some of these functions are what we call, for example, episodic memory or semantic memory. These functions are what we call declarative functions. By declarative, I mean we can talk about them. When we talk about episodic memory, we are talking about a personal experience that we had before. So we are talking about a specific event. So we can talk about that specific event. Okay? Or when we talk about a semantic memory, which means that we are talking about facts, about science, about what we have learned in our science classes. When we talk about these memories, it's really easy to talk about them. It's really easy to be conscious about their content. But meanwhile, when we go from these episodic and semantic memories to what we call habits, motor, and motor skills, these things are basically non-declarative. So we cannot talk about them. And when things are getting non-declarative, then they can get to you what we call unconscious cognitive processes. So we start from declarative processes, and then as you go through this kind of spectrum of different levels of memory, we go from conscious cognitive processes to things that are unconscious. Okay? So this really simplified framework is giving us what we call a functional framework. A simplified model that would help us to have an idea about, okay, we have working memory, we have some executive functions, we have memory, we have some action planning functions, we have some sensory processing functions, and these functions are working together. So that is what we call a functional framework, or what we call a cognitive architecture. So this is a cognitive architecture, just a simplified map about the major cognitive functions that are involved in our brain. Okay? But can we call it a neurocognitive function or neurocognitive framework? No. Here we have not been talking about any sort of brain areas that are involved. But when we are talking about cognitive neuroscience, we like to have these cognitive functions be mapped onto the brain, then it would give us a better idea about what is really happening inside the brain. So in the cognitive neuroscience course, we really like to know about different cognitive functions that are involved in the process of cognition. But not only the brain, those functions, but also how these functions are mapped into different brain areas, okay? So this really simplified kind of framework is going to be with us through the entire course, because we are going to discuss about kind of all these cognitive functions one by one together and discuss about, okay, how attention is working, how memory is working, how working memory is functioning, how central executive function is going to work, how decision making is going to work. So these are the major topics for discussion for the entire course that we are going to have together. And I hope that during this kind of comprehensive course, we would have a good idea about all these different cognitive functions and how these cognitive functions are working together, okay? But this is not the only type of cognitive architecture that people have proposed. So there are different other cognitive kind of architectures that you can find in other resources or other papers. So I'm just going to give you few other examples. So this is one of these examples. There could be some other cognitive kind of architectures. I'm just going to give you just few of these cognitive architectures to just tell you that the model that we discussed today is not the only model that we have in this field. So we have many other models that try to simplify what is happening inside the brain. And in reality, what is happening inside the brain is too much complex in a way that is really hard to understand what is happening inside the brain without these simplified models. And that is the reason that we call them heuristic models, because they help us to have a better idea about what is happening inside. And these heuristic models would help us to try to find the major targets that we would be able to intervene inside and then change the brain function. So that is going to be one of the major topics that we are going to have together in this course, okay? But just before going to the next step, I'm just going to give you kind of few other kind of things that we need to do together. First of all, the model that you have here is from a book that we are going to read together during this course. So this is the second edition of the Fundamentals of Cognitive Neuroscience that has been written by Dr. Gage and Dr. Bars. And they have done a really nice job. I really liked the first edition, but now their second edition is working really well as well. So I think that's a really good quality book that they have provided. And we will have some of our slides in this class kind of using this specific book. And so that is going to be one of the major resources. And I highly recommend the students to provide kind of I usually like to have a hard copy from the book that I'm reading, but it's up to you that you are going to have a hard copy or soft copy from the book. And today we are going to mainly cover the first chapter of the book, and we are going to cover the next chapters overall step by step. And unfortunately, the first chapter is pretty much a light chapter, so today we are not going to kind of be very much in details about the brain function, but through the sessions and through the kind of the weeks that we are going to have classes together, I would gradually move forward and try to give you a better idea about different cognitive functions.